Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is half unremarkable, half bad. I gotta say, it's crazy that they were able to make a movie that's both bad and totally forgettable. Like, most of the time I find that when a movie is this bad, I remember it. But I left the movie theater like 30 minutes ago, and I'm already having trouble remembering what happened in this movie. I feel like a big problem with this movie is that the main goal is built on like 15 other tiny goals, and they all kind of blend together, and you're never really quite sure like what the characters are trying to do at any given point. Okay, right from the very beginning, Rocket gets injured in this attack, and they can't use the med packs on him because he's got a kill switch built into him. So the only way to heal him and make it so that he doesn't die is to like break into this big facility and steal like a passcode that will let them override the kill switch and use the med pack on him. So then they go and they do this heist at this big facility that takes like legitimately 20 or 30 minutes to steal this passcode. And they steal a thing from the facility, and it's not the passcode. They leave that heist, they spend 30 minutes of the movie on this, and they still need the passcode. Nothing gets accomplished during the heist, and there's no like character development or character growth during that to make it like worth anything to the plot either. The heist is just like a 30-minute segment that doesn't fucking do anything. It's completely pointless. I feel like there was a really good 45-minute movie that they could have made out of the stuff with Rocket and his backstory and like what motivates him. If they just made like a 45-minute short film and it was like just Rocket and it was kind of like a side quest where like he went and tracked down the High Evolutionary and he was going to like kill him for what he had done, and they kept interspersing the current action of him tracking down the High Evolutionary with his background, that could have been really interesting. There were moments in his backstory where I was like, damn, that kind of hits really hard. The movie spends a lot of scenes on flashbacks to Rocket's backstory about the times that he was in the care of the High Evolutionary and like the friends that he made. And some of that stuff is like decently hard hitting. But the weird thing is, Rocket is not in this movie for like an hour and 45 minutes. He gets injured at the beginning and put out of commission, and the only things we see of him for the first hour and 45 minutes of this movie is just flashbacks to when he was with the High Evolutionary. And the problem with that is, if you're going to make the plot of your movie centered totally around one character's background, one character's motivation, you can't sideline that character and expect his motivation to just carry over to the rest of the team. The scenes with the rest of the Guardians of the Galaxy, like working to stop the High Evolutionary, are not going to have the same emotional weight because they don't have the emotional backstory that Rocket does with the High Evolutionary. You invested all of your motivation into one character and then completely sidelined that character for the entire movie. I feel like that is just ludicrously incompetent filmmaking. It feels like 15 different people wrote different parts of this movie and then they just tried to stitch them all together. There's like a sort of a hidden subplot in the Rocket flashbacks about how he was the only creature that the High Evolutionary made that ever had like the capacity for innovation or invention. At some point in one of the flashbacks, we find out that the High Evolutionary, his machine to create perfect creatures, was broken, and Rocket came in and he was like able to diagnose the problem like instantly. And then the High Evolutionary is like, how did you know that? Which fucking fair question, because I also want to know how he knew that. And then they just never explain how Rocket knew that. He just has the magic ability to diagnose problems with technology, and that's what makes him valuable to the High Evolutionary. It's just this magic ability that we see him have that is never explained as to like what it is, how it works, or why he has it. The High Evolutionary himself is like as boilerplate as Marvel villains get, basically. His main goal is to create a utopian society of perfect creatures, and he basically manifests that desire by just monologuing about how the world is imperfect and how the only way forward is by destroying the world so he can rebuild it from the ground up. Really groundbreaking stuff. I definitely haven't seen this 1,000 times before in 1,000 Marvel movies. His powers are also completely undefined. Like at one point in the movie, Gamora is talking to Star-Lord and she's like, he's 1,000 times more powerful than you. But then he spends the whole movie like using his magic powers to just kind of push people to the ground and like yelling really loud. Someone's gotta call Marvel HQ and like let them know that menacing villains are not screaming all the time. I don't know, maybe Kang needs to get this memo too. Like, you've had compelling villains before. Did you not learn any lessons about what makes villains compelling? Personal attachment to the heroes. Again, they tried, I'll give them credit where credit is due. They tried to do that in this movie by making the High Evolutionary attached to Rocket, but then for some fucking reason, they just completely put Rocket out of commission for the whole movie. So the only character who has any link to the villain, any link to the conflict of the movie, is completely out of the action for a vast majority of the runtime. Everybody is so goddamn quippy in this movie. I know that's like a pretty common critique of Marvel movies at this point. It's to the point where there are some characters that you can expect to be quippy, and that works because that's with their character. But everybody's like that now. Everyone's dialogue is sort of regressing to this very quippy mean. And like the result is not only that there are a ton of jokes thrown in that just do not land, like they just fucking suck, but also that every character starts to sound like every other character. It sounds like one guy talking through 15 bodies instead of 15 different characters. The jokes in this movie are so predictable and they take so long. They do these bits that aren't even funny for like 10 seconds and they'll stretch them out for like 30 or 45 seconds, and it's like, I'm not laughing. Please show me something else. The action scenes in this movie are not very exciting. I think there's a real problem in Marvel movies right now where in fight scenes, the heroes are just completely invincible. Like, not just that nobody can seem to hit them even when they're standing still, because that's just kind of like par for the course in Marvel movies at this point. Like, even when they get hit, they seem to take no damage whatsoever. Like, they'll get knocked back 15 feet and smash into a steel wall, and then the steel will bend underneath them, but their bones are somehow fine. Like, obviously, they're not going to just, like, break Star-Lord's spine in this movie or something, but it just makes the action feel really low stakes. And, of course, it wouldn't be a Marvel movie without a big CGI battle at the end of it. At the end of this movie, the High Evolutionary unleashes these, like, deformed CGI monster creatures to fight against the big army of good guys. And it's like, why is this in here? None of these CGI creatures are characters that we care about. They're just absolutely meaningless hordes of minions. And I feel like we gotta stop making movies with absolutely meaningless hordes of minions. I'm not saying this movie is all bad. Like, on a cinematography level, there were a couple of shots that I found myself kind of admiring. And like I said, the stuff about Rocket's backstory could have been something very interesting if the character were actually involved in the present-day storyline instead of being relegated to flashbacks. Also, the special effects were really good. Like, the textures were super detailed, but besides all that stuff, this movie is really very unremarkable. At this point, the Phase 5 Marvel movies are illustrating a really interesting point about how important it was to the first 3 phases of the MCU that they kind of had that connective tissue to other movies. I feel like there are a bunch of Marvel movies in the first 3 phases that are very average, that are made more interesting or more fun by their connections to the larger cinematic universe as a whole. Either because different characters can kind of come in and cross over and that kind of makes it feel more cohesive, or because even though the movie you're watching right now isn't very important in the grand scheme of things and is kind of forgettable and average, it might have little seeds of stuff that's going to come back later. Like the first Guardians of the Galaxy, which again was a good movie, but not great, I would say. But it was made a lot more interesting by the presence of the Power Stone and by Thanos. And you could kind of see, oh, there are things here that are going to come into play later down the road. Like, I feel like phases 1 through 3, you could basically divide the Marvel movies into like 4 tiers. There's like the actually good movies. Then there's like the fun or like stylish action movies. Then there's like the totally average action movies. And then there's like the bad ones. And I feel like in phases 1 through 3, even the really average action movies were kind of made a little bit better because they felt like stepping stones on the way to something much bigger. And the problem with the current setup is the average movies are not getting that bump because they aren't tied into something bigger. And the reason it feels like there's nothing tying these movies together is because in the MCU right now, it is very unclear who the whole story is about. And this leads me into a point that I made in my Quantumania review that is absolutely not addressed by Guardians of the Galaxy. Where are my main characters? At this point, every time I watch a Marvel movie, I'm like, are you my main character? Who am I supposed to be rooting for? I know everyone, because they're all great superheroes and I'm supposed to root for all of them. But the problem is, you can't sustain good character arcs for every single character. That's why phases 1 through 3 made the smart choice of having the big character arcs be your main characters, the characters you're making multiple movies about. I never thought I'd be begging for sequels, and I know I just saw one, but whose story am I following here? So far, Doctor Strange is the only one to appear in more than one movie in phases 4 and 5. In the next 2 years of the MCU, every single movie we're going to see is going to be about a different character for the most part. I think the writer's plan at this point is just to keep shoving new characters into the world without actually focusing on any of them. I feel like what we're seeing right now is not just the obvious death of the MCU, which we are seeing, but I feel like the superhero genre is grinding to a halt at this point, which is, I think, could be a good thing. There's just too many of them at this point. I'm making a prediction right now. Superhero movies that come out in the future are going to fall into one of 2 types. Type 1, they're going to be movies that are trying to be this, trying to be a Marvel movie, trying to be a big blockbuster action movie with like a big CGI battle at the end. It's going to be by the books, completely average storytelling. Those are going to be either average or bad. That's going to be like 90% of the superhero movies we see going forward. Then there's going to be the 10% where a filmmaker sits down and actually has a story to tell about a superhero, an actual character development that's going to happen. I think The Batman is a great example of that. I think whatever they do next in the world of The Batman is probably going to be very good. But for the superhero movies that fit into Type 1, I think Guardians of the Galaxy 3 shows us what we can expect going forward, and I think we can expect them to be pretty mediocre. So yeah, that's what I've been thinking about. See ya.